It is fantastic to be here. It's fantastic to make it back to Matamata. I made a bit of a commitment to myself a couple of years ago in 2021. By about halfway through that year, I'd made it through half of the local council areas across the country. We work with a number of them, and so I thought, better put my money where my mouth is and get around all of them. And I've done that the last couple of years. I haven't been to the Chathams every year. That's a little bit hard and difficult to get to, but I've made it to all 66 local council areas on the mainland because I think it's important to sort of get around and have a bit of a local conversation, see how the economy's going with my own two eyes rather than just relying on the spreadsheet. So it is wonderful to be with you. Like I say, I think tonight will be more educational than inspirational. The conversation around rates and similar is a challenging one. Your council is going through it like everyone else is, and of course that's a difficult one because on one hand, council needs to fund itself to provide the services that it provides out to the community, the infrastructure that everyone needs. At the same time, of course, that's a cost to households, and it's not necessarily an easy cost to stomach either. I completely understand that. Hands up please if you've got any fruit or vegetables in your bag. Okay, that's a good start. I might not get pelted too quickly tonight. I guess I do want to say at the outset, as I go through, I want to take you through this for about half an hour and then turn it into a bit of a question and answer. I would love it if we could stay as civil as possible. I will try and do my best as well, and I only say that because I've worked with local government for about 10 years now, and look, this is one of the more difficult conversations in all seriousness. It's tough. I know people have very hot views, and I'm more than happy to engage in them, but keen to engage in the evidence and the numbers rather than death threats and similar. I don't expect anyone here does it. That's a Wellington thing, I think. But again, let's keep it civil, and I'll keep it civil. So let me go through the presentation, probably for the next half an hour-ish or so. And I'll take your questions afterwards, only because I might well answer your questions as we roll forward. A bit of a 101. Some of you in the room, particularly those who are involved with council directly, will know some of this, but I think that sometimes it is worth going back to basics a bit more. So first things first, what are you actually getting from rates? Before we answer the question of do you get enough bang for buck, well, what is that actual bang that you're asking for? Well, I did as any good Gen Zer does these days. I had a look, I wrote my own list, and then I compared it to what ChatGPT gave me, and it gave me, funnily enough, a pretty similar list. And I think it is sort of worthwhile looking through the amount of stuff that local government does provide, generally through rates. Anywhere from sort of the hard network infrastructure, you can see the waters there, drinking waste and storm. Don't mix those three up, very bad idea. Also through to rubbish and recycling, making sure it's picked up, making sure it goes somewhere, making sure it doesn't just end up in a hole in the dirt always, if you can try and minimise some of that waste at different places. Roads and footpaths, anyone with a pothole is fairly clear on that and wanting to make sure that they can shift those around. But also, of course, the distinction between your state highways and your local roads, and certainly around these parts, as a slightly more provincial council that you guys exist in, that means quite a long distance of local roads. They need a lot of repairs because they get taken out by heavy trucks and what have you, but at the same time, remembering that a fair amount of that money goes through to central government first and foremost. Your Fonterra truck drivers, for example, who are driving the trucks that rip up the roads, that money goes first and foremost back to central government, who eventually might give it back to your local council to spend on behalf. Public transport, much more for the regional councils, but sort of in the same ambit. And then we get on to some of the more important parts, in a sense. That's some of the hard network infrastructure, but some of the other parts that make life a little bit more worth living, the likes of parks and sports fields, swimming pools and playgrounds. Those are often the areas as well that people are quite keen to say are nice to haves, and I often think, as someone without kids, that saying to my kids that their playground would be a nice to have at some point in my life wouldn't make me a particularly good dad. So some of this is all important in different ways, shapes and forms. The other ones are the likes of libraries, community centres, elder housing, and then some of the important but often a bit more behind the scenes stuff, environmental protection, building controls. No one liked leaky homes back in the day, and no one would want them to see come through today. There's always a bit of a balance. You want to make sure that you can develop as much as possible without too many bits of red tape getting in the way, but you don't want to make poor quality stuff either. I say that as a Wellingtonian who has pipes breaking and who sometimes lives in a house with no insulation. I'll take slightly better standards where I can. The likes of planning and zoning and land use, so that again there's a bit of a balance between everyone's competing interests. food quality standards, noise control, dogs and animal management as well, the old good emergency management when it all goes pear-shaped, heritage protection, economic development, cemeteries and a lot. And I guess I say that because most of the time, and again having worked with local government for about 10 years, people often think about the hard network infrastructure first, and I completely understand that. They think about the water pipes and the roads and the recycling. And I worry sometimes that central government often gets both praise and abuse at times for doing what they do, depending on which party's in power. Local government seems to get a lot of complaints when things are going wrong. Completely agree with that. I've never talked to a council yet that's got a message coming in the front door saying thank you for making sure the roads are still there and that I get safe drinking water. That's just sort of a by the by. Council should provide that. That's the general expectation. No one necessarily gives them a bouquet for it. And I'm not saying that you should, but I think recognising that there is quite a broad set of services. Now, what does it cost to provide all of those? The latest official figures that came through from Stats NZ, and I've cross-checked these thankfully with Council's annual report, is that in 2022 fiscal year, it cost $68 million in operating spending. Now, important distinction here between operating spending and CapEx. OPEX, operating spending, has to happen each and every year, and it pays for staff costs, it pays for maintenance and what have you. It's generally seen as something that is repeating. Your capital costs are a bit more of a one-off that then themselves will create an OPEX cost. So good example here is a road. If I was putting through a new road, wherever it might be, that's a CapEx cost because I only build it once. But then afterwards, the maintenance of it, I might need to spend $200K a year to make sure the lines are repainted and that it gets resurfaced and what have you. That turns into the operating cost. And that's important because a lot of these operating costs are the things that you get day to day. They are the sorts of things that are a lot harder to take away because it would very much be things that you're currently receiving and that all of a sudden you wouldn't be. On the capital cost side, when it comes to CapEx, that's things that sometimes you can rephase a bit, but would also be some of the more vital infrastructure that you might not get. And there's often issues that we find with councils around the country, and like I say, I'm from Wellington, we quite clearly haven't invested enough in our water pipes, and so all of a sudden the water pipes break and instead of me being able to shower, it all goes out in the middle of the street in a geyser. So it is one of those things where it's important. Now you can look down that list of OPEX as well and see where some of those most important bits are. You can see that a pretty substantial amount, sort of getting close to a quarter, going directly on roads. Again, sort of the sort of thing that I haven't found anyone yet that said, gosh, council spend too little on roads. The need for maintenance is critical there. The likes of the waters as well coming through, both water supply and wastewater. There we go. And then to some of the other areas, you look at the likes of recreation and sport. So again, that's some of your parks and what have you, other bits and pieces. But you can see that the bulk of that money does go towards some of the bigger, crunchier, critical areas, and there's sort of not a huge amount in others either. Gives you a bit of perspective though in terms of how that distribution comes through. How do we pay for all of this? Well, most of it, but not all of it, because you'll see here, like I said, total operating spend 68 mil, and CapEx is around 26 mil, I think, in the last year that I saw. So, we're talking some big numbers. A lot of that, but not all of it, coming from rates. Now, we'll get into a little bit in a second over how we actually calculate rates, because there's some big misconceptions out there in the market. But you can see a pretty big bulk of that, nearly 29 million for Matamata-Piako, coming from general rates. And so that's sort of the flat rate, if you will, that goes out, uniform general charge they call it, sort of the flat amount that everyone pays for, and then some other differences depending on the relative capital value. Like I say, we'll get into that conversation in just a sec. Then you've got some of those other targeted rates, and they are targeted both because sometimes they might target specific geographic areas, or, and in this case, a little bit more specific funding streams. So making sure that money sort of is one-to-one going into certain areas. You can see the investments that go into the likes of water, rubbish, and other things like halls. So all up, 45 mil coming from you and the local community to provide for that. There's a big question then in terms of how rates work, in terms of who should pay for these services. Now, taking a bit of a step back, and this is sort of an economic thought process that we go through all the time. Some stuff I'm better to buy myself because I have certain tastes. I like camembert cheese rather than brie. So if the government was buying everyone a block of cheese every week, I might not like it, or everyone that liked brie might not like it if we did it in that sort of group style. I can't pay for a private security guard each and every day. It becomes pretty expensive for me. So there are some things that I'm better to group up. Equally, I don't go and say to everyone, hey, I'm going to build my own little separate road to drive the certain path that I want to every day, because that's an absolute waste of money. Better to pool our money together, get a better bang for buck over time. So there is a big question when it comes to rates around how is that best split up in terms of, is it user pays, or do we sort of all pitch in? As someone who is on Wellington's alcohol licensing committee, the district licensing committee, there's an interesting question there that often comes up over, again, who should pay for that? Is it just, say, that the bar or the restaurant who has that license? Because, of course, if they pay for it all directly, then they'll recoup it in their costs that they provide out to the people who come to their establishment, and that means that only people that go to that establishment pay for the cost of that. Sounds sort of sensible enough. However, if that happened all the time and there wasn't sort of a more general thing, then you wonder if there would be as many good operators across the country. And importantly, you've got to ask a little bit of a question over how much does having some vibrancy, having some good cafes, bars and restaurants in an area provide the social amenities so it's a nice place to live. And so there's often an argument for a bit of a split. You don't often find things that are completely done one way or completely the other, often a bit more of a balance. You see things as well in water, for example, that's often done where there's a certain amount of water that everyone gets, a sort of a base level that, 8,000 cubic metres or whatever, and then above that you might start to pay for it a bit differently. Same with the likes of rubbish and recycling and what have you. It would be the sort of thing that if everyone had to pay a general amount for the likes of rubbish, then why wouldn't I create as much as possible, go and dump it in the tip, while someone, this lady in the front row, for example, she might only have a bag's worth a year. We'd be paying the exact same amount and I'd be getting way better bang for buck than anyone else. And so again, often where there's sort of a volume that's used, that's where we see some differences. Now, if I ask most of you in the room how your rates are calculated, you'd say the higher my valuation, the more I pay each and every year. Correct? Broadly? Yeah, there's a few nods out there. Maybe not everyone, maybe we've gotten around that one a little bit. Higher property values don't technically always mean that you will get higher rates. And I say that because there's sort of two steps in the most simplified version that I'm trying to give you when it comes to rates. The first one is that the council comes up with the size of the pie. They sort of go, look, okay, we need to provide these services. The community is demanding this from me, roads and water and rubbish and all the other stuff. Now, it's going to cost me X amount of dollars. Now I've got to figure out how I get that X amount. And so, in its simplest form, that X dollars becomes the size of the pie. They need to find X dollars worth of pie. Then they go, well, how do we split this up most equitably amongst the population? Because we've only got rates, there's sort of not a lot of discussion to be had over doing it another way. Councils can't tax you, they can't go and ask for a little toll every time you drive into town. They don't have that power, they can rate you, however. And so what they do is they look at the value of those properties and they sort of work out what that should look like. The intuition being that the more expensive a property generally, the more that you might be required to pay. Values being a bit of a proxy for ability to pay. Now I know a lot of you out there will say, well, property prices have increased massively and nor not necessarily have my incomes, and completely agreed. It's sort of the less fantastic outcome, but the outcome that central government has provided to local. But importantly, if you were, and as you've seen the last couple of years, house prices have massively shot up across the country. Now, if you imagine three houses, one in Te Aroha, one in Morrinsville, one in Matamata, the Te Aroha one went up by 20%, the Morrinsville by 30%, and the Matamata by 40%, wouldn't mean that the rates go up by 20, 30 and 40% for those respective properties. What it might well be is that the average increase across the region, or across the district, was 30%, in which case the Morrinsville one, who got the 30% increase in line with the average, would have broadly the same proportion of rates. They pay the same as they did before, proportionally. So if they used to pay 1% of total rates, to make the maths easier, they'd still pay 1%. That person in Matamata who had a 40% increase, 10 percentage points above the average, would pay a bit more because they've now got effectively a larger dollar share of the total value of the district. whereas the person in Te Aroha who had a 10 percentage points difference lower than what the average was would probably pay slightly less relatively. Now, because costs go up every year, most people's wages increase at some point in a year-to-year basis, most goods increase, so do local government rates, but the proportion that each person pays is dictated a bit more by the property values. Now, one of the real difficulties, I think, when it comes to talking about rates is that it's a very, very obvious number. Now, going to expect, here's an assumption, let's try it in the room. How many of you pay rates directly? I'm going to presume most of you, yeah? Can you, hands up please, if you can tell me your rates bill, last rates bill to probably the nearest $10. Oh, less of you than I thought. Most rooms that I've gone into, almost everyone can tell it to me. I bet you anything you couldn't tell me how much tax you paid to government in the last year. I certainly can't. And the difference there is because I don't get a bill for my tax. I just never get to see it. My paycheck, when it comes out from Infometrics, it says, here's the amount we put in your bank account, thank you very much. And I never see the tax. That gets passed through to the accountant, and the accountant sends it off to IRD, and I never see it. So I never know how much I've lost because I never had it. Whereas for rates, you get a bill in the mail and you very specifically have to pay it. And I think there is a bit of a psychological difference that comes through there. But I do want to show you some numbers that highlight, and this is not sort of saying that rates are insignificant, but it does sort of pale in comparison to what central government can do. And I say that because increasingly that is one of the things that local councils are facing, is that they're between the rock and the hard place. They can't go and, like I say, stand out the front and hold. They can operate through rates only. Here's a chart that LGNZ has put together, released just today, that highlights the size of the tax take as a proportion of GDP. You can see the very skinny little sort of light thing down the bottom, that bit that you can barely see. That is the share of local government rates, around about 2% of GDP over time. The big red bit is what central government collects in tax. And you can see a much larger proportion of GDP sort of getting above that 30% mark. And so it is one of those things where it creates some big differences. Now, what I've also done to make this a little bit more real is I've given a bit of a crack at looking at what rates look like here in Matamata versus what some of you might pay in tax, to give you a bit of an example. So last year, according to the annual report, the sort of average per ratings unit rates bill was about 2,500-ish, 2,600-ish for a household. Now, I've assumed here that the household in my model has two people in it, two adults that are earning the median wage or the average wage here in Matamata, which is about $70,000 a year. And I've assumed that they also spend like an average New Zealander, and they pay GST on those purchases. So we're including income tax, we're including GST here. That's the difference. So 2,500 from rates, near on 40,000 from that two-person household coming through in terms of average tax paid to the government. So you can sort of see the big differences there in terms of the ability for local councils to play with what is a relatively smaller amount of money, while central government has quite a bit more. So in terms of bang for buck, if I look at what I get from local councils in the sense of, again, I get my roads and I get hopefully clean water, maybe not in Wellington, we're working on that, but I get my water, I get my recreational services, I get my cemetery when I might eventually need it, I get my swimming pools and bits and pieces, I get some, important regulation. Don't always like it, but it is important to make sure that things stick around long enough. If I look at what I get from central government, generally speaking there, I'm not paying for a direct service. And I think that's probably one of the differences I'd like to highlight, is that rates are effectively just a big composite charge for a service. Instead of me paying for all these things individually, I pay council to try and group it together and do it in a slightly more efficient way than if we all were purchasing it individually. From central government, I get some things that indirectly benefit me and might benefit me, but not always. For example, I haven't needed to use the Defence Force to go and take out an enemy yet, and I expect that they probably wouldn't allow me to, but there is sort of a wider public good in some of those. The safety net being provided through by the likes of benefits or providing for superannuation and similar, that stuff that I pay for day to day on my paycheck, I don't get that. I don't get paid super, don't get a benefit and similar, but it is part of that wider social contract. So the slight difference here is that that sort of smaller value that you get from rates, that is sort of a direct user charge for the various things you get, the water and the transport and what have you. The average tax paid, a little bit more divorced. There's not necessarily a contract that I have with government that says I will get these things each year. It's often a bit more of a make sure you do well for the country, and I'll vote for you every couple of years and make sure that you're on the right track. Importantly as well, and to sort of reinforce this point of where people's money goes, I just want to also highlight just what rates, local government rates add as a proportion to the inflation basket. In the last set of data we've got, rates make up about 3.2% of average sort of spending in the inflation basket in terms of weight. Now, I'm not saying that's insignificant, but I do think it's important to keep some of these conversations in context in terms of just how large are we putting them. You can see that, oh gosh, sorry, it's cut off some of the different parts. I've only given you every second. Well, that's all right. We'll carry on with those and we'll make sure that we look at the rest. Your food bill is sort of sitting in the top couple here. I'm pretty sure food is that second one. We spend quite a lot on, funnily enough, housing first and foremost, and then food, the two essentials, if you will, in life. Then going through. Like I say though, you look at that sort of the housing group at the top, around 27-28% of average spending, around about 10% coming from rents, 3.2% coming from rates. So important, but certainly sort of not the biggest and sort of most influential driver of inflation, but worth sort of keeping in mind. There's a big conversation around rates at the moment, funnily enough, because we are seeing much larger increases. Local government New Zealand today announced that their sort of straw poll currently of councils across the country suggests the average rates rise is looking at about 15% this year. That would be the largest since amalgamations began back in 1989. The current largest that we've seen in more recent times is around that 9.8% increase on average that came through last year. But there is sort of, in a sense, a good reason for that, as much as I'm sure that people don't like to believe it quite as easily, but what we are seeing is quite intense inflation coming through to the household sector. And so I just wanted to run you through some of that and why, in a sense, previously the conversation with increasing rates was what more do I get for those rates? Now the question is, how much more do I have to pay just to hold things still and get the same stuff I got last year without having to think about even the ability for growth? So, in terms of driving it higher, again, there's a lot of infrastructure needs across the country, and as I showed you right at the start, the bulk of council money is going towards those network infrastructure needs, the core hard stuff, the roads, the pipes, and similar. A lot of that, funnily enough, we fund through debt, and that's a more than appropriate way to do it. Everyone often says for both central government and local government that taking on debt is a bit of an issue, which I think is a bit of a misnomer. How many of you, please, hands up again, we'll try this crowd participation, have a mortgage or have had a mortgage at some point in your life? Yeah, so you've all been in debt, and very good debt, because it would be a rather stupid way to live for your life for 40 years to save up to buy a cash house, rather than getting that loan and being able to pay it off over time. And it's because you are going to use it for a long period of time. For the likes of local government, when they're putting in a road or a pipe or a bridge or whatever else it might be, it's not just the people today that are going to use that bridge or pipe or road, it's going to be people for probably 50 to 100 years. And so it doesn't make sense for just today's people to pay that, which is why you then get effectively council mortgage and you go and buy one of the bridges. However, as everyone knows, you've got to make those mortgage repayments each fortnight, and that's effectively what rates do, is it means that the rates are able to pay off that mortgage that the council's taken out on all of those assets over time. And because of that, it means that when interest rates spike up, like they have recently, you start to see those issues coming forward. Here's what local councils have paid in terms of interest repayments each and every year back from 1992 to present. You can see that sort of hockey stick upwards in the last 2 years. At the moment, interest repayments by local government are up 65% from pre-pandemic levels. And that's a combination both of those much higher interest rates, but also because we've actually seriously been investing in our infrastructure in more recent times. If you look at some of the reasons why, of course, like I said, there's increasing demand for roads. We've got more and more people, and those more and more people are driving more. More and more people driving more means more wear and tear, which again requires you to fund more so that you can actually keep the roads at the same sort of standard or close to that same standard as before. When it comes to water, again, not only have we had population growth, and that requires more and more water and different pipes to come through, but some of the bigger assets that have been constructed over time, they need replacement, particularly wastewater treatment plants and similar, built often in the 50s and 60s. They've come to the end of life, as any good building and bit of equipment does. My iPhone, for example, the first one that I ever got, doesn't work anymore, it's a bit shoddy, need to upgrade it. That's effectively what you've got coming through with the likes of some of those assets. But you've also seen changes in standards. Oh, Oh, we're going. Oh, I was going to say we just need to move. I was going to say someone's heard that from the water regulator and they're like, shut it down.
It's all about energy.
Yeah, well, and look, I mean, cost controls are important. When it comes to water standards, I think is another area. We've seen, of course, some pretty awful outcomes in parts of the country, Havelock North, a couple of years ago now, that created some challenges. And New Zealand, all of a sudden, as a country, and certainly from a government perspective, went, we're not happy with that standard, that quality of water that we've got, so we need to up it. Now, in a sense, upping it doesn't necessarily mean finding better water. You don't sort of find a better well next door, but you do change some of the ways that you monitor that. So you hopefully pick up some of those issues beforehand, and so you're not facing Campylobacter like Queenstown and similar have been. But all of that comes at a price. You need to employ more people to look after the compliance of those water schemes. You need to buy more chemicals to test all the stuff and what have you. Same water that you had before, but a much bigger cost to do all of that, and again you're investing in that time and time again. We've looked as well at Infometrics at what local government operating costs look like. And this is a little bit different from your household costs, right? We've normally gone, and we've had a conversation in recent years around how intense inflation has got, but one of the things I don't think we've dug into quite as much is how different it is. For example, households, as I showed you before, a big proportion of our money goes on food and on housing and similar. Funnily enough, I've never met a local government yet who has a big proportion of their spending, 17% on food. They don't buy food. There's not that many bananas that councils can eat, trust me. And it's the same when it comes to, again, rents. Councils aren't buying rents for residential property, they've got to think of other things. They're buying bitumen, they're buying concrete pipes, they're buying people, skills and professional services. And so, in a sense, looking at household inflation, the Consumer's Price Index, is great if you are a household that buys bananas, and absolutely rubbish if you're an organisation that buys pipes and bitumen and similar. So, we had a bit of a look at Infometrics and trying to calculate what those costs would look like, and you can see them here. You can see as well that those growth figures are approaching sort of 8% per annum compared to the 7.3% per annum peak that you saw for the likes of the Consumer's Price Index, so some pretty big operating costs. The kicker though, and the real challenge that we're seeing, is it's those infrastructure costs that are continuing to increase in price. Here's a few of them. If you look at civil construction here, the green line, peaking at 15% per annum, that's more than double what the Consumer's Price Index growth peaked at. That's what you pay for your roads and your water pipes and similar. That's the cost that local councils are facing and having to provide for. What that means is at that point you have to pay 15% just for the exact same thing as you did the year before. You don't get anything better, you don't get more road or more pipe or more bridge, you get same bridge, just different, much more expensive cost. To put that in a bit more perspective, when we looked at councils around the country, over the 10 years from 2021 to 2031, local government was expecting to spend around about $77 odd billion on the hardcore network stuff, your pipes and your roads and similar. To deliver that exact $77 billion worth of stuff, not the dollar figure, but the length of roads, the number of pipes and what have you, today would cost you $88 billion. So you've got to somehow find an extra $11 billion amongst all of that to pay for exactly what you thought you were going to get before. Nothing more, just the exact same. And that's because some of these costs have been incredible. Like I said, for the likes of households, average household costs have increased at their peak about 7.3%. They've gone up about 20% cumulatively since the start of the pandemic. Here are some figures that will likely shock you though, and again, you don't buy this every day, I wouldn't expect you to know these figures, but these are some of the issues that we grapple with. The cost of a bridge these days, compared to 2020 levels, is 38% more expensive. Again, no extra bridge, you just have to pay nearly 40% for the exact same components, the same concrete, the same steel, the same structure, and similar. For sewage, which again, pretty important to get rid of that and move it away to the right place, 30% more expensive to do the exact same stuff these days. The likes of roads and water systems up 27%. All of these considerably higher than what headline inflation to households has been. Another way to put it is that here's the blue line here is what we would have thought that sewerage systems would have cost. Now ignore the number on the side, just sort of look at the trend. That was the price level that we thought it would cost. And from 2021, that's the deviation that started to come through. That's that sort of 30% increase that's emerged. For the likes of bridges, again 40% or 38 was the number there. You can see how big the gap is. Now again, that's sort of each and every year. It's a whole new level, which means that if I was expecting to build a bridge this year, it would cost 40% more. If I was expecting to build a bridge in 5 years' time, that will also cost 40% more than I already expected it to cost over time. And it's that sort of gap that is really starting to hit. No council across the country, including yours here locally, would have thought that building a bridge or building a road or whatever would always remain the same cost over time. Everyone's sort of smart enough to realise there is some sort of escalation you have to build in there. But the last couple of years have had such intense price inflation that things have gone even further than anyone's wildest dreams. So, like I said to you before, bridges have increased about 38% in the last 3 years. About 24% of that was completely unexpected. The rest of it was sort of broadly anticipated, but that 24% is completely unexpected. Now, to put that in a bit more context, you can see that the likes of roads up about 20%. The average gap for general infrastructure is about 20 percentage points. Now, to give you an idea, if I was a council, say, and I had 5 $20 million projects 3 years ago, and I came into the community and said, guys, we're going to do these five new roads, each going to cost 20 million each. I would now have to say to you as a community, look, one of those roads is not going to happen at all to fund the cost escalation on the other 4. And that is one of the challenges that are coming up for local government at the moment, is that those increases means that if you want to get the same services that you got last year and the year before, you're having to stump up a lot more than previously. That's not a question of, can I get more? It's how do I get the same as I did before at a relatively quite more expensive price. And like I said, that's seen the likes of local government rates increases continue at nearly the highest level since 2004 at 9.8, and the average coming through at 15. So when it comes to bang for buck, the question at the moment is not necessarily how do I get more and more out of local government, it's how do I get the exact same stuff and maybe try not to have those increases coming through as massively. And I think before I open it up to questions and conversations, one of the most important conversations I think that's going to happen in the next wee while with your council and with councils across the country is what is the community wanting here, quite seriously, because if it's costing 40% odd more for a bridge, if it's costing 20-25% more for water systems, there does have to be a difficult conversation of is the community wanting a certain set of things, and if they are they willing to pay for it? And if they're not, and this is an important one, I think it's a more than justified conversation, if the community is not willing to pay for that, what things are not the best things to go forward? Because we might not have enough money, we might not have enough resource to do absolutely everything that we wanted to before. It's the same as, look, at the moment I'd like to go over to the US with some friends and also maybe buy a house one day. I can't do both of those all the time. I have to make a bit of a prioritisation decision. What do I want to do first? What do I want to do second? What do I want to do after that? And so I think a more than reasonable conversation that will happen between communities and local councils is, what's the community willing to pay for? What do they want out of it? And more importantly, what are they willing to give up? And I say that finally, when you come to your conversations with council, and I think that's important that you do, the fact you've turned up here tonight is fantastic. Engagement with local government is critical. Is, I think, coming with a bit of an ask, but also a willingness to sort of throw something else in the ring as well. If I, for example, were to come to your council and say I'd like another road, or my road to be paved or similar, it'd be useful, I think, for elected members if you also came and said, and I'm happy to give up these 2 things in the plan because I know that I can't put anything in without something else coming out. There's no more free lunches in the local government space. There's a lot of money that central government has that they haven't yet been willing to provide through, and so the only way at the moment that we provide for all of these critical services, particularly infrastructure, and that is the main cost for local government, is through rates. It's a bit of a blunt system, but it's unfortunately the system we've got, and so we either work through it or we see if central government can change it. Don't know about you, I don't see a lot of impetus coming from central government to do it. So again, working within the system we've got, figuring out the best options and the best outcomes, and having those conversations with each other so that we can figure out where we are going into the future remains critically important. All right, I'll turn off the fire hose for a second on that. I'm going to take a drink of water for a moment, but more than happy to take any of your questions and turn this into a bit more of a conversation. Thank you very much. Any questions? Stunned silence is also a good start, especially after a rates conversation. But feel free to throw up your hand if you do. Yes, sir.
So like Matamata at the moment, there's a lot of growth happening, new subdivisions and what have you, and some quite big developments going on. Like that obviously puts a huge, what do you call it, on the infrastructure, local infrastructure. So who's expected to pay for that? Like everyone else in the community?
Yep, no, it's a good question. So
these guys are going to be benefiting. These developers are benefiting. Well, they're going to be benefiting out of these developments that they've obviously.
Yeah, and what will normally happen, one of the real, and this is a challenge around that sort of chicken and the egg, is that you can't get people to pay rates on the infrastructure before they have a house sort of thing, so there's sort of not an ability to do that. They will recoup that over time, which is often why that debt sort of comes into it, because then you can sort of front load the spending and then put that back on certain areas over time. That's also why government and local government is exploring with how do you better do that. And so there's have been conversations over how much do you direct that in terms of, do you say new subdivision out wherever has to pay a certain targeted rate for their infrastructure over time? Equally though, I'm going to suspect that none of you who already had houses necessarily paid for the start of your infrastructure either at the start. So there's a little bit of push and pull there in terms of, like I say, probably maybe a bit of targeting in some areas and not in others. Does Matamata have DCs? I was going to say, and I only say that there's a few councils in the country that don't. So there's development contributions. So that developer will have to pay a certain amount of cash up front to help fund that infrastructure in the first instance. So that doesn't go through rates, but it is sort of an upfront cost. The reason I wasn't 100% sure is there are some parts of the council, parts of the country that don't have development contributions, and it's an interesting conversation. One of my former neighbouring councils up home in the far north, they didn't have DCs for a while, and the reason they said that they argued for not having DCs was that they said we want to attract people and we don't want to put a barrier that developers have to pay something immediately because it might mean they don't come in. And what they found was very quickly that exactly what you've just been saying, that they were paying a lot as a council and the general community for this stuff. Developers weren't having to contribute, and that meant that all of a sudden the community was going, well, hang on, why am I sort of doing this first? Yes, I was getting more development, and that might be helpful for the community over time, but having to stump up the full cost was pretty uncomfortable. So they are now, I think, starting to charge DC. So that's another area of the sort of funding tool specific for that sort of growth element.
Do the development charges, are they targeted to a specific thing in the council, or are they just go into the big pot and council decides how to spend them?
So what council will do with that is where they will set the development contribution based on what that development needs. So if the development needs, I don't know, 2 kilometres of pipes and 2 kilometres of road, they'll effectively be charged the equivalent of that, so the council can then go and fund it. There's not, well, generally there's not the sort of thing where you sort of say every development pays $500, no matter if it's for 60 homes or 600. It's a bit more conditional on what they will require. Any others? So
there's been talk of the GST that councils collect, they should keep, not give to the central government. What's your pros and cons to that argument?
I don't think there are many cons in a sense. I mean, I think it's important that councils do get more ability to raise revenue in different ways. One of the difficulties, look, I think it definitely should happen. Don't think of it as the golden egg that sort of solves things immediately. It's just not that much money. And sort of to the gentleman's point before, one of the challenges is that it only happens post an action. So it happens once I get a building consent and I go through and eventually, I pay that money to the council sends that GST off to IRD in Wellington, and eventually IRD might send it back to the council under this proposal. That's not necessarily going to help me if I'm the council trying to put in a pipe tomorrow sort of thing, because it might take a year for it to go through the system. Because you would still need to charge GST. I think that's quite important. The idea would never be that you exempt consents and similar from GST. You still have to pay it, it would just eventually come back to your own area. What I would possibly rather see, and here's one of the other things, and again, I haven't gone into absolutely everything tonight because, geez, we could be here for a while, and I think even people that have been involved in councils for 40 years learn something new just about every day. Is one of the other areas that you get is the likes of the Land Transport Fund from central government. So central government will talk to all the councils each year and say, look, this is the pot of money, we're willing to fund your council to a certain percentage for your local roads up to a certain amount. So I might say, look, I'll give 43% up to $10 million to Matamata to do some roads. So council says, look, I want to do a bit of road, central government will fund some of that through Waka Kotahi. The difficulty is that that's the only thing that gets that central government support. If I'm a council, if I'm Matamata and I need to put some water pipes in, for example, I've got to pay for that all myself. And I do wonder if, given the conversations around three waters and all that, one of the difficulties is that if I'm a council and someone says to me, look, you've got $1 million left over in the budget, wouldn't that be a dream? What do you want to spend it on? If I'm a council, I'd be an idiot if I spent it on anything but transport, because I get a rebate. I get a bunch of money from the government, so that 1 million becomes a bit more. If I put it on pipes, I only get $1 million worth. And so I think what economists talk about in terms of incentives being misaligned, you don't have that coming through, because it means that councils are more likely to spend on certain areas than others because building pipes is expensive. So the pitch then would be, instead of say GST, although that might still be somewhat justified, is would central government be better to use its big amount of debt room, because it could take on some pretty reasonable debt, set up a fund that says to local government, look, we'll fund you, I don't know, 40% up to a certain amount every year for pipes or for wastewater treatment plants and similar, which were originally constructed by central government back in the 50s and 60s. So look, I think it's a good idea. I think it's more than good to rebate it back to councils. It's just not the sort of golden egg that some people make it out to be. Any others? Sir?
Is there a reason why we don't see multi-storey homes here?
Oh, jeepers. Going to imagine zoning might be part of it to start with, but also, I mean, it's one of those things I expect that you probably will over time. It depends on where you are though, in terms of how density is likely to play out. And I say that, look, I'm from Whangarei originally, and you know, that's sort of a more provincial city, and so you've got quite a mix of things, but even in Whangarei, until very, very recently, we didn't have apartments, you know, which most other cities around the country do. And so I expect for an area like here, it's the sort of thing, the base case, the expectation for a long time has been around single story dwellings, you know, your sort of quarter acre dream, and then eventually more people are thinking of going into them. Across the country, we know that now over half of consents for sort of medium density townhouses and similar. I live in one, it's great, I don't have to mow the lawns. I know some people like doing that, I couldn't care less. And so it's sort of a different option. Increasingly, one of the reasons that those sort of attached dwellings are coming through a bit more as well is because they generally seem to be a bit more cost effective. I mean, housing isn't cheap, but if you've got a spot of land and it can take one standalone house or it can have 3 townhouses on it, that's the sort of thing, it becomes a bit more affordable for me as a young first home buyer to start to get into. So I think you will see more of that. Central government is requiring more housing. Now, how that comes about is a bit different. There's conversations from the previous government around what they call medium density residential standards, MDRS, one of the two, and that would or see the ability for you to build anywhere, you know, 3x3 options. The current government thinks that that's a little bit over the top and you know, risks having too much potential upzoning in places that don't necessarily have the right infrastructure, and so instead they've said, look, councils, you don't have to do that, but you do have to make sure there's 30 years worth of land available for people to build on, so there's no bottlenecks anymore in terms of development. Now, the difficulty, as we've just sort of highlighted through here, is that if you were to click your fingers and say there's 30 years worth of land ready to develop tomorrow, you'd have to have a lot of pipes and a lot of road and a lot of other stuff ready to go, and that stuff's expensive. So that creates a bit more of a compromise that you can't do that, you can't enable more housing without having infrastructure to start with. You can't build a house and then retrospectively put a road in or a pipe in, you sort of need that to start with. So there is a real difficulty and a real challenge at the moment where some of that densification requires a bit more front loading of infrastructure. That means you sort of have a bit of a bow wave of investment that needs to come through from local government. You will reap the benefits of that, but it takes a little bit longer again. But I do expect you'll see more of that to come in. Any others?
What's going to happen with retirement, people going into retirement, more property for these people who have got, you know, need to go into more property for them?
Yep.
So I see just getting less and less for the elderly, and the elderly are going to be a lot more.
Do you mean in terms of
Housing for them.
housing from like aged care providers or like their own houses, if you will? Yeah.
Little flats everywhere, but there's not any more being built.
Correct. Well, and this is one of the wider challenges. This is sort of outside of local government's remit, but it is an interesting conversation for the country. Is that Generally speaking, we build sort of 2 to 3 bedroom homes because that's what families are often needing. But at some point we will need to think about those smaller dwellings because generally speaking, older people are only needing 1 bedroom or so and maybe a bit of spare room, but there is sort of a bit of a compositional shift that I think will come through over time. There's also an issue around sort of how people continue to pay for housing in retirement. The likes of superannuation, for example, is sort of predicated on the idea that people have already bought a house by the time they retire. So if you're still paying rent and similar or mortgages, it becomes a bit more difficult. One point though to make, because everyone often says that retirees and similar find it a bit more challenging to pay rates because they have a fixed income. Not quite true. Superannuation changes each year based on wages and inflation, so actually it does account for some of those increasing costs from the likes of local government as well. Yes, everything's compromised and a bit more challenging in that arena, but you do see some of the adjustments over time. But I think it is something we're going to have to confront over the years. The difficulty, I think, is what do we do in terms of converting our housing stock? Like, do you take a house that is currently a 3 bedroom and knock it down to put 3 granny flats on it? Like, and then rinse and repeat in 100 years time when we've seen a younger group of people that have come through and now they don't need granny flats, they need something bigger. Which is where you do imagine maybe there's a bit more of an ability to build houses that we can start to separate off. So maybe a townhouse or one of those sort of denser options where you can have a bit more of a dividing wall that could be installed at some point in the future, still has a more than perfectly reasonable home, but also sort of allows for some of those differences in living styles. We know that people are also increasingly living more intergenerationally. People have got their grandparents living with them, they've got kids living with them, they've got others who come in, and so it is sort of, we're moving away a little bit from the classic sort of mum, dad and 2 kids sort of option. We've got a much wider group of households now that we've got to cater for, and that includes an increasingly older population too. Yeah, and so absolutely, yeah, same sort of thing. So,
in regards to councils containing costs and some of the health and safety provisions, such as traffic management and this kind of thing, when you're doing your roads, I've seen examples just around here where you've got, they're doing some transformers even, and then what they've done is they've got the cones out there, the transformers are well off the road, but you've got your traffic management sitting there and doing nothing, cleaning the front of the vehicle and mucking around. I've got photos, and there's many examples of this. So council are bound by those health and safety, may I say, useless regulations in some respects. Some of them are absolutely necessary, but it's over the top, no common sense. The second thing is also with councils and water, metering of water. We've only been in this in Matamata for 2.5 years. We had a new house built. There's no meter, no water meter. We've come from another place and they meter water. It makes you restrict your water. It's just plain stupid, isn't it? I don't know, am I missing the point?
You're broadly on the money. The first one's really interesting because I think, and look, I sympathise with when people see, what they regard as inefficiencies and similar. The difficulty, I think, a lot of the time, well, there's a few there, is one, it's generally not a huge cost. From a local government point of view, they'd be paying those contractors sort of no matter what. So the difference there a little bit is how could you make sure they are as efficient as possible, sort of thing. So, could they spare some men or some of the cones to go into another site and similar? I think there's always a conversation that goes on. But it's also the sort of thing that as much as that costs, trust me, council getting a bill from the courts after someone dies or gets injured and similar would cost you a heck of a lot more than some of that. So I think there's a need for some sort of allowance, especially because it's not something that local government can directly do. It's a central government obligation. I think it speaks to a wider challenge in New Zealand where we often sort of flip-flop from one end to another in terms of not enough regulation through to quite extreme regulation, because something bad happens, and that's completely reasonable. You understand why we do that. It's just that we seem to miss the Goldilocks zone quite a bit, or in a sense. And again, I'll come back to this. I'm not picking on you, I promise, but it's an interesting example, right? In terms of I bet you there's not many times though that you've seen good roadworks and similar going on, taken a photo of that and gone, geez, those guys, I'm pretty chuffed with how they're going. And I only say that, like, we are naturally predisposed to sort of seeing the issues. It's the same as there's a concept in economics that we often recognise higher costs more than decreasing costs, or we sort of ignore the fact that our own wages and similar have gone up. So there is a bit of a challenge there. Now, water, okay, don't get me started too much because we could be on a rant all night. Water is like the only, just about, I think we've gone through this, the only thing that isn't somewhat regulated with price. Like everything else is. Your power bill, you don't just get free power. You don't pay a set charge and you just get it, and all you want. You pay for a certain amount of it. Food, again, I don't walk into New World and say, look, I'll give you $200 and let me fill up a trolley and however else much I get. Even rent, I don't go and say, look, I'll take the nicest house you have and just pay a flat charge that someone down the road that gets a crappy house would also get. So it is one of those things that water is one of the few assets where there is a lack of any pricing structure. More importantly, and this is well, not controversial, but it takes you a bit of time to get your head around. People often say, well, you know, you'd be charging for something that's currently free. I'd like to take you back to my things before. That water ain't free. That water costs you quite a bit. It's just that, again, there's no recognition for who gets it. And I think one of the challenges is that you do often find quite big changes when you do install water metering. So Carpety did this back 2014, I think. To be fair, the council got kicked out the year later, and I think it sort of shows how short-term people's views are, that it was a good move. It's just that the populace doesn't like it. They saved 20% of the water that they previously used. And it's because people, it's not the sort of thing, and this is actually quite true, it's not the sort of thing where people all of a sudden drink less or actually have particularly short of showers. But what it does is it does two things. One, it means that those households who don't use nearly as much water don't pay that much for it, and that those who do, you know, have larger families or have larger water use for whatever reason do. More importantly, if you suddenly get a bill and you're like, look, everyone else tells me it's supposed to be $30 a month for water for 2 people, and my 2-person bedroom is paying $6,000 a month, where is the water going? Oh, there's a pipe that's burst outside that no one ever knew about because no one's ever thought to think about it, but now all of a sudden I have a price signal. So I ring up the council and I keep ringing them up every second of every day until they get rid of the $6,000 bill because it's flipping expensive. And so that is generally where I think we should be going with those things. Now, the difficulty, right, is that that's great, but retrospectively putting in water meters is also not free. And so I think it's one of those things where, again, to some of the points that have been raised earlier, you then have to put that commitment up front, and that's got to be paid for up front, and it will be, yes, spread across time and similar, but cash flow wise, you've got to have the cash money right there, right now to pay for it. Councils are under debt constraints and similar, and so it will be a bit more expensive to get in, but I absolutely agree, long term it's a very important move. It is the only asset that we don't currently attach a charge for, and we should. And what we often see, just the final point, is that you can, because one of the issues that people often bring up is that some people will need a certain amount of water always, and that's true. What we often see, particularly for commercial use and similar in other councils across the country, is that you get a certain base charge. You pay, again, your $10, and everyone gets 1,000 litres a year or something, and after that you start to get a volumetric charge of $1 a litre or whatever it might be, sort of thing. So that's a much more appropriate way sometimes of doing it. You have a little bit of a base level, everyone gets a certain base amount, but then over and above that you pay based on what you use. I think that's more than reasonable. I do that in every other part of my life.
Yeah, but surely that would be better to put those meters in as a building.
Yeah.
They're a lot cheaper to do it while the trench is open and the toby's going in. Imagine doing it retrospectively at every property.
Oh,
It's gonna be a horrific cost.
Completely. One of the challenges though with that is that if you do that before you've taken a decision as a council that everyone does it, then the people who are moving in there go, well, how come I'm going to get slammed? Now, of course, you don't have to turn them on and use them and something. Yeah, no, completely agree. But trust me, having been in other parts of the country where that has happened, it gets people's hackles up like you wouldn't believe. And so I think it's one of those things where, again, and to this conversation, geez, we've had a good one. I've had no tomatoes thrown at me. It is that sort of thing where I think we need to have that conversation of, look, we are probably moving in that direction. Here are the reasons why. We might not be able to make a district-wide commitment today or tomorrow, but eventually we would like to bring them in. So yes, maybe we can start putting them in, but you know, then you'll immediately have those letters to the editor and people sort of saying all sorts of stupid stuff. And I think that's for the community to go, actually, I'm going to ignore the BS and go with what is realistically coming through. So yeah, no, it's a fair point. Over here, and then we'll go to the gentleman here, but over there first.
Sorry, you may not have a spreadsheet for this one.
Give me a go.
I'd be interested to know if there's any kind of correlation between community engagement and the financial performance of the council. I've come from a city and how they were quite separate.
Yeah.
Here, and it's a very different feeling.
It's an interesting, long story short, no, I don't have any specific numbers to my fingertips that can show that, but I think it's one of those things where often you see, it's almost a bit of a U-curve, right? If you're in a particularly good position or a particularly bad position, you often seem to have more engagement. Now, I'm not necessarily going to say that's good quality engagement, but you often do see a bit more. In some of my previous roles, I've been on youth councils or youth advisory groups. And in Wellington back in, I think 2019, it must be maybe 2018, we were going through a plan process. And we worked quite deliberately because of some of the things that were coming down around housing affordability and similar, and managed to get some of the best youth turnout in terms of consultation that council had ever seen. And I think that was because the issues and the conversation were sort of done in a certain way. And I think that's why you're also increasingly seeing changes in how local government particularly consult. I mean, it used to be, right, that you had to go to the council's website and get a form and sort of, you know, fill out if you agreed with the funding impact statements and go through all of the legalese and similar. Like I say, I've been doing local government for 10 years, and trust me, the documents are brutal, and they're legally obliged to be. Now, I think the difference now is that you've got events like this where councils are going, actually come along to have a conversation, come and tell us what you want. There's sort of more and different mechanisms that come through, and it's not increasingly write a big tome, you know, either chastising local government or telling them what you want. One of the things that we've done in Wellington a few times, that I'll bash Wellington enough tonight, I'll give you a good story, is that we sort of, we did some consultation with young people. We put up some big posters on the walls with sort of the 6 big projects that needed to happen. And we gave everyone that came into the room a certain number of dot stickers that effectively were the amount of money that council had. So, you know, you couldn't have more dot stickers than that because there wasn't cash available. And it was go and put your dot stickers on the ones you want. Now, if you think that option 1 is something that desperately needs to happen, you can put all 6 of your dot stickers on it. But if you want, you know, split it halfway between these 2, then that's how it might happen. Like some of those changes in how we're doing the consultations and democracy and similar, I think is important. But again, all of that costs. It's pretty cheap to sit back and say, please email me some documents, we might read them eventually. Doesn't necessarily put forward the best engagement. Things like this, conversations like this sort of do cost a bit of money, but I think it's quite reasonable. So no, I don't have particularly good evidence on the finances versus the engagement, but I would also sort of say there's a concept in economics we talked about in terms of opportunity cost. And I'd really like to think that if you didn't have good consultation, things would be even worse than some people probably believe them to be. Sir.
So this is just going back to the water thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was just, let's throw it in. In regards to water metering, etc., councils need to put out that conversation or they put it in with the rates, they put it out in the paper, and they say, we're looking at doing this, what do people think of this? And then it's like the government. Often before the budget, they leak certain things, and then you come through the budget and go, oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And so there are ways of doing this, and I think that a lot of people might agree with it. It might help to smooth it out.
Totally, and look, to be fair, I mean, gosh, you might be in the middle of some big conspiracy that even I'm not aware of in that case, because you've got some elected members and similar in the room who I think will be taking those notes. I think that the big challenge is that, again, look, I mean, how many people in the district versus how many people are here tonight? Like the challenge is that there is still quite an amount of education that needs to go on, and I think the worry is that you will have some households in this particular conversation who will go immediately, they will freeze up at the idea of water meters. And so I think that's why, again, part of it should also maybe be, it's not just council that does it, but it's you guys all, now that you're more educated, you go and have those conversations. It doesn't have to be anything formal. The best conversations I've ever had on these sorts of topics are over, you know, barbecues and that in summer. So I think it is sort of a wider conversation that will grow over time. But very much take the point, and like I say, those who actually do have the decision-making power here, I'm sure they're taking that on board as well. I might wrap it up there and we'll go for questions there afterwards. I'll stick around for a bit, so thank you very much. Back over to the host.